Joined by my guest, Joe Lauria in Alexandria. He's the editor-in-chief of consortiumnews.com. In Washington, we have John Kiriakou. He is a former CIA officer. And in Paris, we cross to Jean Bricmont. He is a political commentator. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. I'll go to Joe first in Alexandria. There's not much debate in Western media and in the public sphere in general about the conflict in Ukraine, which is a real pity because at the end of the day, it is at the expense of the Ukrainians, actually. But because there is no trust left, we have admissions from Merkel, Poroshenko, and Hollande that they never dealt in good faith with the Russians, and I'm obviously making reference to the Minsk process. So negotiations at this point are not really in the cards, and I really don't see how, in a normative sense, negotiations will be played out. This is going to be done unilaterally, one way or another. Joe.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're probably right. Let's establish that this war should never have happened because, as you said, they were not serious about the Minsk Accords. They were deceiving Russia to set up, to train NATO, to train Ukraine for the war that they wanted, that they needed. It started in 2014 with a coup. Nobody in the West knows that, or very few people. There's no debate. There's no discussion. There's no historical context. There's no understanding of what Minsk is. There's no understanding that NATO and the U.S. were offered treaty proposals in December of 2021 by Russia to create a security architecture that would include Russia's security interests. All of that was ignored by the West because they wanted this war, and they got it. And they have no intention, you're absolutely right, of negotiating this. They are admitting that Russia is winning the war, that Ukraine is losing, even though it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on the ground, by the very fact that they want to send more armaments, including these German tanks, which is the big issue being discussed. So I'm afraid that there are various scenarios, and we don't really know, of course. It's impossible to know when and how this war will end, but the scenarios would be the destruction of the Ukrainian military. Russia could seize all of its historic Russian lands that were in Ukraine. They could have to take Kiev, perhaps, in order to finish denazification, although I don't see battling for Kiev in the streets of Kiev to take over the capital, but some engineering of a coup d'etat may be possible. That may end the war. Ultimately, the West wants to keep bleeding Russia so they can get back to their ultimate aim, which was to overthrow the Russian government, right, weaken it with the economic war, with the information war, with the proxy war, all of which are failing, I must say.
Okay, John, let me go to John in Washington here. You know, discursively, if you look at how this narrative has been constructed, and Joe did a wonderful job of introducing it here, the problem with negotiations, as people call it in the West, is that towards what end? See, I would like to see peace. How do we achieve peace? But the problem is NATO, Washington, London, Kiev, and Warsaw, because those are the major capitals in this, they want victory. Now, see, victory and peace, you know, they're two very different things. And if you want victory, well, you're playing with the ultimate weapon that could possibly be used in a conflict. But if you want peace, that's a very different story. But that's not a track they want to take, John.
Oh, I think that's exactly right, Peter. And you know, the American government has not prepared the American people or the American Congress for peace. They've only talked about victory. And you're right, they're two very vastly different things. You know, here in the U.S., in the mainstream media, we see only news about how well Ukraine is doing. We see reports with headlines saying Russia is losing. That's a disservice to both the American people and to the Ukrainian people. Nobody's prepared for either a long-term battle or for peace, which, as you note correctly, is very, very different from victory.
Jean, because of the way the narrative is constructed here, Europe is taking the brunt of this, at least economically. We may even see social and political unrest as a result here. Because you have characters like the head of NATO, Stoltenberg. If Ukraine is defeated, then the West is defeated. But I thought the West wasn't involved in this war. They can't even keep their narrative straight here. And what it does is that I can guarantee you, and I'm only expressing my personal opinion, Russia will not lose this conflict. Under no circumstances, under no conditions, it will not lose. Now, what losing and winning can be up, it's in the eyes of the beholder, let's put it that way. But from the Russian perspective, they're not going to lose this. I don't think Europe was prepared for that. The decision makers for the preparing for this war, they weren't prepared for that. Russia was supposed to buckle in a matter of days. The ruble was going to go to trash, and it would be all over. But it hasn't, and it won't happen. Jean, go ahead in Paris.
No, I'm quite convinced that Russia will not lose. But of course, Ukraine is losing, but it's not collapsing yet, at least. You see the front line move, but not very fast. I mean, it's not like the German line in 1918. It's still more like the trenches war. So I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, the West pours more and more weapons there. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm worried about the intensification of the conflict. Now, Estonia is speaking of blocking the Gulf of Finland. If they do that, it's an act of war.
Yep.
But of course, if Russians react to that, they would easily overrun Estonia. That's not the problem. But then it will be another unprovoked aggression against a NATO member, Article 5, blah, blah, blah. I don't know what they're going to do. And I'm also interested in the internal repression, especially in France, because you may know or not know, but now they have totally banned RT France. They have cut their source of funding. I mean, the banks cannot pay them, get money anymore. So the banks cannot pay, they can't pay their workers. So you have 100+ journalists all on the dole at the same time. And there is a campaign against them. Some people say they should be vilified. They've been working for the enemy and so on and so forth. I mean, the attack on RT France are just unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Oh, Jean, it's not unbelievable because they don't believe in free speech anymore. That is something they don't care about.
That's the least you can say. But the great 68 newspaper, Libération, which still has Serge July, an old 68er, they're coming back to write for them. Of course, violently anti-Russian editorials. I mean, this newspaper was the most vicious against RT and wanting to ban RT. So it's really, in 68 they say it's forbidden to forbid, but now, of course, it's compulsory to forbid. I mean, it's really amazing how the change of the situation. And then, of course, I mean, RT, the banning of RT for me is a major step. And of course, Bernard-Henri Lévy, who is not as influential as he used to be, now he says there should be, of course, tribunal after the war, tribunal, of course, for the Russian leadership, but also for the collaborators, and there he includes...
Okay, but Jean, you're making my point here. Let me go back to Joe here. Tribunals, all of these things here. I mean, there's no pretense of trying to find a solution to this conflict here. There is actually, there is one, though. Go back to December 17th, 2021. That's what Russia wanted. It was made public, and it was brushed off. Those demands are still there, and that's your starting point if you want to have negotiations. But I think we're going to get the same exact response as we did this time as we did then. Joe?
They want to eliminate Russia.
In April, there was an opportunity. There was an opportunity for a negotiation right then, and Ukraine would have come out in a lot better shape. Of course, they would have had to agree that Crimea and the Donbass were part of Russia and not join NATO. But of course, the United States and Britain, with Boris Johnson in the forefront, prevented that negotiation, and they will continue to prevent that. If Bakhmut falls, or when it falls, that could be an opportunity then to enter a negotiation, because that is a very symbolic battle going on right now. But I don't think that's going to happen, because the West wants this war to continue with the grave danger that it could escalate to the ultimate conflict, and that could be the way the war ends. We're all dead. And this is what the West is playing with fire right now. They will not accept that ultimately they will have to agree to those treaties or some form of that they will have to accommodate Russia's security interests, like the OSCE said, like the the Helsinki Accords. This is something that even Macron and Scholz, at least early on in the conflict, were making some noises about it until America told them to shut up, basically. Yeah. So that is the only way to do it, is to get a negotiation. Now, I don't know whether Russia's interested at this point in a negotiation. We don't know exactly what their ultimate
but Joe, I think I can answer that a little bit, at least from my observation. Let me go to John here. Well, why would the Russians go into negotiations with anybody in the West? They've been lied to left, right, and center for years. Why would you even contemplate talking to these people? No, what's going to happen is political facts on the ground will be made. John, go ahead in Washington.
Yeah, exactly. You're exactly right, Peter. You can't trust anything that the West says, because everything has been a lie. You know, we say this here all the time. The Russians have several different times, just in the most recent history, trusted the West to be honest in their negotiating points, and they've never been honest. You know, we hear a lot too, Peter, here in the United States about the Russians being willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. Well, I would say that the truth is that it's the Americans and NATO that are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. We hear in the news every day here about tanks, right? All the news over the weekend was about tanks, tanks, tanks. Tanks aren't going to change the course of this war. The Ukrainians can't win this over the long term. The only way that they could is with direct NATO intervention, and that just simply won't happen. In the end, we're going to see the destruction of Ukraine. We're going to see the destruction of the Ukrainian government, and we're going to see the movement of the Ukrainian people out of the country unless they agree to sit down with the Russians, just as the Russians asked many, many months ago, and negotiate a deal.
Yeah, well, you know, all I can say about the ridiculous tank conversation, they all melt the same way, gentlemen. They all melt the same way. All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a hard break, and after that hard break, we'll continue our discussion on the end game. Okay, so let's go back to Jean in Paris. You know, if we look at all of the recent controversies, we can go back to Russiagate, and we can go back to perceptions of the 2020 election in the United States, and all the things floating around the Biden administration right now. And then, of course, we have Ukraine. And they all have one thing in common. Bad and flawed narratives create bad outcomes, bad policy outcomes. And we're talking about in this program possible endgame negotiations. But if I go to our guest in Paris, well, any negotiations with the Russians is Munich. It's Munich every day. It's Munich, okay? How do you get out of that cul-de-sac? Because you know, it's giving moral justification. Geopolitics is not about morality. It's not about values. It's about power, okay? But the West will always commingle all these other ridiculous things and never really get to the heart of the matter. As I said in the beginning of the program, if you want peace, then work through that prism. They refuse to do it because every day is Munich. Go ahead, Jean, in Paris.
Yeah. It's funny that in Germany, for example, the AfD is warning against sending tanks to Ukraine, saying that the last time they did it, namely in 41, 45, it didn't end up very well. And in France, the people who call themselves anti-fascists say, no, because of the German past, they must send the tanks because the new Hitler is, of course, Putin. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. You know, a long time ago, an ex-communist told me that the problem with censorship, if you censor all your opponents, then when you make a mistake, there is nobody to tell you. And that's exactly what the West is doing now by basically shutting down all the voices. And I gave the example of RT. RT was, after all, the main. I've known many journalists from RT. There was none who were pro-Russian or pro-Putin. They just wanted to give a job while giving alternative information, like people do on small websites. But then, of course, those people have to beg for money and they don't get paid. And when you work for RT, you could do the same work while being paid. That's the difference. But these people are not pro-Putin or pro-Russian or Hitler and so on. They were not far right. All those I've known, and I've known several of them, they were not like that.
Well, I mean, with the problem, Jean, I mean,
it's
it's not about being pro-Russia, anti-Russia, why don't you just have a debate about the issues? That's all I try to do on this program, okay? You can dissent all you want. You can tell me anything you want, barring swearing at me, and I don't really care because it's your opinion. Let me go to Joe. Joe in Washington, Alexandria, excuse me. You know, Joseph Borrell, the vaunted EU foreign policy chief, he said something very curious the last few days. He said, the West has to support Ukraine, but respect Russia because Russia defeated Napoleon and Hitler. So that's why the West should support Ukraine. I mean, the lack of logic and clear thinking from these people is really astounding. I mean, their foreign policy chief doesn't know history very well. That makes him, you know, a person to talk about an entire bloc's security future with its neighbor. It's extraordinary the lack of merit and competence these people have. Joe.
Yeah, well, sometimes these people that are held up in the media as being great leaders are not very smart, as you just pointed out. And the ones who are smart know exactly what they're doing here. And I think there are smart people in U.S. leadership who know exactly what they're trying to do. This is for the U.S. the opportunity they've wanted ever since Putin came to power and Yeltsin was gone and they lost control of Russian society, finances, resources. This is what they want to get back again. But we have to understand that the leaders themselves may be self-deluded. They have created an incredible psyop, and they may be victims of their own psyop. And that's what is so frightening about this, that the escalatory nature of the U.S. position at the beginning, it was Biden who said clearly, we're not going to get NATO involved. We're going to stop. You won't be able to attack Crimea. We're not going to send weapons that could reach into Russia. This keeps changing. And this is what's so worrying right now, so that the ultimate scenario what could happen would be the ultimate end game, which is the end of the world. And I don't know whether this understanding is in a person like Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, for example, or even Joe Biden anymore. I wonder if they would know the fire that they're playing with here, and that only a negotiation right now could stop this. Otherwise, this could go on for years. And if it goes on for years, and it could lead, as I say, to the absolute greatest nightmare of history.
You know, I saw John nodding his head there. Go ahead. Tell me why you were nodding when Joe was speaking. Go ahead.
Well, I think Joe's right. And, you know, I think that the West should pay very close attention to a tweet from former Prime Minister Medvedev on Friday and a statement just yesterday or day before yesterday by the chairman of the Duma. Russia will not lose this fight, period. This is an enormous country. It's a nuclear power. Ukraine is an existential threat. We hear a lot of comparisons here in the United States to the U.S. fights in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's nothing similar. There's nothing comparable between the U.S. and Afghanistan and Iraq and Russia and Ukraine. And it's because Ukraine is directly on Russia's border. It's an existential threat. And because it's an existential threat, Russia cannot and will not lose this fight. I think that's something that the West just simply doesn't understand and appreciate.
Yeah, because they're blinded by their own ideology about their own moral virtue. It's really bizarre when they're putting the entire fate of humanity based on their self-perception of their virtue versus to the other, meaning the Russia. Or I mean, you could go back to Borrell, the garden and in the jungle. Okay, that's how these people think. Very neo-colonial in a way. Jean, you know. We're talking, unfortunately, in some sense, apocalyptically here. But before we get that, the U.S. pays almost nothing. It's not losing troops. It's making arms sales left, right, and center. And Europe is paying the price on almost every single way. I mean, we talk about, it truly saddens me, the suffering of Ukrainian people, because this conflict should have been avoided. It was avoidable. But I love Europe just as much, and I just see Europe paying the cost here. The Germans and the French now are announcing 40% 4% increase in defense spending. Yeah, well, you had your welfare state because you didn't have to spend so much on the military, okay? That's all going to go away. Your civil liberties are under challenge. You've been talking about RT France here. I mean, you know, for all Europe's support of Ukraine, what's it get for it? What's it get?
Nothing, but you see,
Nothing.
Nothing, but the intellectual and journalistic class has been totally bought by the United States. That's what de Gaulle was saying. You know, de Gaulle said that the way the Americans do, they give you a pack of whiskey bottles, or they send you a seminar in the United States, or a dinner in Paris, or something like that. And that's the way the corruption goes. And the whole class has been corrupted beyond belief. I am absolutely baffled to see how lackey of imperialism, as you used to say, these people have become. I mean, they're complete lackey of the United States, and it's all because it's freedom, it's democracy, and so on. They don't inquire about any lack of democracy or freedom in the United States, and I truly believe that politicians like Scholz and maybe Macron are not as extreme as they seem, and they're not as extreme as the media, but they're constantly under pressure from the media or from the Greens. In Germany, the Greens are just unbelievable. They're the most warlike party that you have ever seen in Germany since Hitler.
Well, Jean, you know, I don't want to ask anybody their age on this program, but I do remember when the Greens were very, very different in the 1980s, okay? We'll have to do a special program on that because I don't know what the hell happened to those people here. But let me go to Joe. Jean brought up something I think is really important. Sergeant Schultz, as I refer to him on this program, and Macron, they have, it's very interesting. I'm glad Jean brought this up because, you know, if you listen to them closely, like on even days opposed to odd days, they talk about after the conflict, what has to happen. And they get shut down immediately, or in the same speech, they'll say, but we're 100% behind Ukraine, you know, whatever it takes. But both of them are actually thinking about after the conflict, which is very interesting to me. And they have their eye on Washington at the same time. Joe, go ahead.
Well, these are the two who could have provided the bold leadership that was needed to avoid this conflict. And instead, they, as Jean pointed out, they get browbeaten, they get bribed. I'm not saying Macron and Schultz were bribed, but that is the European political class. This was Europe's chance also to be independent of both Russia and China and the United States, to stand on its own, and they blew it as well. They have become more and more of a vassal of the United States than ever before. And this is one of the great tragedies that we've seen unfolding, up to the point where their own interests, the interests of their own people, and they have to win elections, are being hurt so badly. It started way back in 2014 when Germany was forced by the U.S. to put sanctions on Russia back then, and the German businessmen went crazy. They didn't want it then, and Merkel went along and did it anyway because the Americans wanted to, and they were listening to her telephone, so she probably knew that. So, I mean, it is a tragedy all across the board here, and unfortunately, and this conversation hasn't changed my mind one bit, I don't see any way out of this. I only see things getting much more frightening and more dangerous every day this conflict goes on.
I agree with you, and John, you know, being an American, living in America, have we reached a peak Zelensky yet? Because I mean, it's truly extraordinary. We thought the drive to the Iraq War was like, you know, the greatest propaganda gambit of all time. This has to take the cake. I mean, it's extraordinary when I talk to people, the lack of knowledge we have. You know, when the catastrophe hits, no one in America, or virtually no one in America, is going to know why. Go ahead, John.
Peter, you can buy Zelensky action figures in stores now. That's how we've reached the point of ridiculousness, that you can buy a Zelensky action figure to have as a souvenir. You know, one of the things that has surprised me from the very beginning of this conflict is that so few Americans recognized what was behind it. The United States cannot maintain its international hegemony when there's a strong Russia and a strong China.
Yep.
It would have to destroy one in order to focus on the other. And I think that's what we're seeing here. This is an attempt by the United States and its NATO allies to destroy Russia or to bog Russia down over the long term in a war that will slowly bleed it, so that the United States can then focus on confronting China. That's why we saw Nancy Pelosi go to Taiwan with no complaints from the Russians.
And John and Kevin McCarthy is on his way here. Gentlemen, that's all the time we have here. But I'll make my prediction at the very end, being the host of the program. The end is the end of NATO, and that'll be a good thing. Okay, I want to thank my guests in Washington, Alexandria, and in Paris.